Hello, and welcome to Season 2, Episode 3 of Stuart Saturday Live. I'm your hostess, Andrea Zuvich, the 17th century lady. Well, it was lovely to have historian Gareth Russell with me on the last Stuart Saturday Live last month, and we chatted about the loves of King James VI and First, Anna of Denmark, archives, and more. His book, Queen James, is out now in the UK. If you missed that episode, you'll find the audio for that and all previous episodes of Stuart Saturday Live available on my podcast, The 17th Century Lady. And all Stuart Saturday Live videos are available on YouTube. Well, some news from us first. Earlier this week, Orland Media Limited, our family-run media company, released Blood Feud, Book 1 of the Rebellion trilogy. Written by Paul Bernardi, this historical fiction is set in England in 1067. So what's it about? Well, King Harold lies dead on the battlefield, and William of Normandy has been crowned King of the English in Westminster Abbey. Far to the north, however, Oslac, thane of the village of Acomb, has only one thought on his mind: revenge. Descended from the ancient line of the kings of Bernicia, Oslac is a man of honor for whom debts must always be repaid. My husband Gavin narrated and produced this audiobook, and I did the proof listening, and it was fun to pop into another time period for a change. It's available on Audible. We're currently working on 2 audiobooks for 2 different clients who write fiction set in the 17th century. So watch this space. We're really excited about this. And moving along to the 17th century now, which is, of course, my favorite time period. When studying the history of Stuart Britain, most works tend to focus upon historical figures such as the Royal Stuarts and the Lords Protector. James, Charles I, Oliver Cromwell, Richard Cromwell, to a certain extent, Charles II, James II, William and Mary, and Anne. But there were, of course, many other people whose lives impacted the history of the country. So the subject of today's show is Thomas Butler, Earl of Ossory, who, during his lifetime, was widely known of and considered a hero, and was a friend to the likes of King William III and John Evelyn. He died in his 40s, and in the centuries that followed his death, he has been largely forgotten, sandwiched in between his more famous relations. But who was this man? Joining me today to chat about Thomas Butler is a historian who has brought him back out of the shadows of history, shining a light onto his life in his brilliant book, Thomas Butler, Earl of Ossory, 1634 to 80, A Privileged Witness. Joining us live from Oxford, England, please welcome Dr. Daniel D. Jordan.
Hello, Andrea. How are you? Thank you so much for having me.
You're very welcome. I'm so excited to have you on the show today. First of all, I would love it if you could please tell us about yourself and when did you become interested in history?
Well, I guess I should start with some full disclosure. I actually come from County Carlow in Southern Ireland, and was born in the city of Kilkenny, the same city that Ossory was born in. I actually come from right in the very heart of Ormond territory. So they've sort of always been there in the background. There's always references to them. They're sort of the foundation of the local history. But I didn't really get sort of academically involved with family until university. But I always did have an interest in history from a child. Like many historians, it was the inspiration of a specific teacher who brought history to life through his amazing bank of anecdotes. He was a walking encyclopedia, our history teacher at secondary school. But the secondary syllabus was very much focused on the modern era. So when I went to university, I tended to drift towards eras that I was less familiar with, including the medieval and early modern period. But it wasn't until my final year that I sort of gravitated towards 17th century Britain. I'd done a number of different electives on, the early modern France, etc. But there was a marvelous elective, which was painfully under subscribed in my third year undergraduate degree, called Restoration Diaries,
Oh,
and
wow.
and it was there was only about five of us in on the course, but it was a very exclusive group, and it exposed me to a world I knew nothing of, but through the medium of 17th century diarists such as Roger Lowe, Samuel Pepys, of course, John Evelyn, and the very famous female travel writer Celia Fiennes. So it sort of opened up a whole world that I knew that I'd previously known very little about, and I wanted to know more. So I embarked on an MA after my first degree in early modern Irish history, and that evolved into the PhD, which I completed in Oxford in 2011, focusing on the life of Thomas Butler, Earl of Ossory.
Awesome. I wish they had offered such courses when I was at university. I would have been with you in that sort of class. Wow. It is quite often a neglected time period, I think.
Absolutely.
But you did travel and studied quite widely in different places, didn't you? I mean, you studied abroad as well.
Yes, I was in Vienna for a little bit, and that was before coming back to start the masters. I was trying to figure out what sort of career path lay for me, whether perhaps an avenue in diplomacy or academia. But you try get away from the 17th century, but it keeps dragging you back.
Yeah, I understand. Fantastic. Oh, it's just I love hearing about what makes people gravitate towards history, and it's lovely when there is a history teacher, as you had, that really motivates you and exposes you to such interesting topics and fosters this love and appreciation for history. I did have a teacher when I was in secondary school as well, and I'd get quite embarrassed by him because he was a really tall, larger than life man, and there was two different campuses, and he'd see me walking towards his class, and he would say Zuvich, and it was like, but anyway, he was really great, and he put on my a resume once, a recommendation, and he said that he thought that I could be a historian because I was one of the people who he thought was really interested in history. And that stayed with me because he really supported me. And so that I feel like that is something that's so important when an adult sees you and tries to help you and guide you towards that. Exactly. So that's really, really lovely. And so we're going to be focusing on the Butler family and this gentleman in particular. So why are they important? I mean, who were they? Imagine those who have never heard about this family,
I mean,
please.
So the Butler dynasty were the Earls of Ormond, and they were the largest landowners in Ireland, by a long way. And they'd come over in following the Norman conquest in 1169, and they were sort of one of the leading of three major families in Northern Ireland, and eventually became the leading family at the expense of the others as the centuries rolled by. And it wasn't just the amount of land they owned; it was where it was. It was in the east and southeast, which was the most politically important and the most economically valuable. So they really had the sort of the golden patch in Ireland. Their seat was in the city of Kilkenny. Kilkenny Castle, on the banks of the River Nore, but it extends, north into Carlow, where I'm from, and then further southwest into Counties Tipperary and parts of Waterford as well. So really extensive landowners, which of course gave political prestige and position in the country. So it was a huge family, very extensive, with in a sort of a feudal system. There were lots of relations and sort of sublords, etc.
Wow. It's very interesting. And you mentioned the castle. Would you please tell us about the history of this castle and its connections, as you mentioned, with the Butler family, please?
Yeah, so here we have two images from the National Gallery in Ireland, two 17th century images of Kilkenny Castle. And it had been built, like so many other castles in both Britain and Ireland, during the Norman period. Specifically, this one was started in 1260. But it was heavily remodeled, as you can probably see in the lower image, in a 17th century Renaissance style. So it really was, the kind of seat to reflect the position of this great family, the greatest family, basically, in Ireland, as the Earls of Ormond were, and to symbolise their prestigious role in Irish society as the greatest landowners and their wide patrimony across the southeast of Ireland. It was heavily remodeled in the 17th century. There was a great banqueting house put up at one side of it, which I think you can see. It's the sort of round tower on the extreme left on the top image.
Yes.
And that's no longer there. But that was basically built as an entertainment spot for suppers. And again, it was remodeled in the 19th century. Today, it's mostly a sort of a Victorian residence. And it was handed over to the Irish state in 1967 by the 6th Marquess of Ormond.
Oh, how very interesting. See, I didn't know about this, and it's so lovely to see how it's changed over time there.
Yeah, I mean, it dominates. It's
Yeah.
like all Norman castles. It's in a strategic position on a high elevation over the River Nore. So great vistas of the countryside. And when you drive into Kilkenny, it sort of towers over you in the streets below. So it's not too dissimilar, but on a much smaller scale, of Windsor Castle.
Oh, yes. Right. I've mentioned this before, but right outside of my office window, there's Bolsover Castle. So it's on this the highest elevation of the area, and so you could see that they thought of all these things and the best area for these fortifications. That's really lovely. Thank you. Ossory's father, James Butler, first Duke of Ormond, is better known than his son, isn't he?
Yes, he is. Yes.
He had quite an eventful life.
I mean, his life was very adventurous. If you invented it, people would say it was too much. It was too elaborate. It was unbelievable almost. I guess there's two reasons for that. One of which is the fact he lived a very long life. And secondly, the time in which he lived was a very tumultuous time, particularly in Ireland. It's often said that 17th century period was the time when modern Ireland was effectively molded, with the good and the bad. It all it can be traced back to this pivotal century. So he is very famous. He is equally famous in England at the time as he was in Ireland. He was sort of your classic cavalier, adventurous cavalier. He went into exile with Charles II after the English Civil Wars. But his personal life was rather tumultuous as well. His own father, who was the heir to the earldom of Ormond, drowned off the coast of Anglesey. So he became, at a very young age, the heir to this huge patrimony. And his wider family were all Catholics. His parents were Catholics, but he was sent to England as a ward, and he was raised by initially a governor, but then later went into the as a ward of the Archbishop of Canterbury, George Abbot. So he was raised a Protestant in England, and then when he returned to Ireland, he returned as a Protestant of this of the greatest patrimony in Ireland. So now this was the way that the sands were shifting at the time. But that also helped him in the political games that were afoot in the 17th century, where the winds were blowing in the Protestant direction. So he was very much sort of embraced by the establishment as a trusted figure because, number one, he was a great landowner, and secondly, he was a Protestant. So this allowed him to advance his career with great rapidity, initially in Ireland and then later after the Restoration in England. He becomes Chancellor of the University of Oxford. He becomes he's given a title in 1642 as Marquess, elevated up to the status of a Marquess. And then later, after the Restoration, he becomes the first Duke of Ormond. So it's a symbol of the trust that the monarchy had in him, that specifically Charles II had in him, the thanks and as a symbol of gratitude for going into exile in Europe during the tumultuous period of the interregnum. So and then that's what sort of opens doors in London to a really prestigious career as well in England, where he stays a lot of the time. And this allows him to appoint Ossory as his deputy in Ireland, effectively.
I see. Wow. You mentioned he had quite an interesting personal life. I'm wondering, who did he marry?
He actually married his cousin, a lady called Lady Elizabeth Preston, the daughter of the Earl of Desmond. And here we have a portrait of her, courtesy of the Office of Public Works in Kilkenny Castle, where it hangs, and baby Ossory. He's probably about 6, I think. We're not quite sure, but he's about 6 or 7 in that picture. Now she was there was a family feud with regards to the inheritance of the Great Ormond estate, and she was heiress in her own legal right to a majority of that estate. So you might, I don't think you'd be overly cynical to question the reasons why she ended up marrying the heir to the minority stake in the estate. So basically, with their marriage, the patrimony is reunited into a single under the leadership of a single united family. So it's obviously for dynastic reasons. They get married at Christmas in 1629, and it resolves sort of a generational dispute as to who owns which lands. So technically, she owned Kilkenny Castle by legal right through her father. But ultimately, it's all reunited and it's all made very, very tidy with the marriage in 1629. And then, of course, in 1633, James Butler inherits the earldom of Ormond, and she becomes the Countess of Ormond. She's a remarkable figure, and she's getting a lot more attention now. Just recently, her letters have been published last year, 2023, by the historian Naomi McArevey, and they're really interesting. She is a very strong character, which, in an era of strong women, she's a really remarkable woman. So, first of all, in 1641, there's a great rebellion in Ireland, and she and her young family are evacuated from Kilkenny and moved to the comparatively safer sanctuary of Dublin Castle. But it's only part of a much wider period of turmoil in Ireland and England, with the Civil War in England starting in 42. She moves to England in 1647, and then to France with her husband in 48. She's back in England in 1652 on her own, directly petitioning Oliver Cromwell, who's since conquered Ireland. The monarchy has been removed. Cromwell is in charge, and she's waiting in the drawing room for 12 hours, just for the entire day. And he's really impressed by her determination, and she successfully petitions him for not only a pension, but also the restoration of some of her estates in Ireland, which she's awarded in 1655, and she goes back to Ireland and basically, while her husband is in exile, and basically runs the entire show. So she's not somebody who suffers fools gladly. Her letters are, really convey a remarkably strong character, and somebody who is a force in her own right.
Well, that's amazing. And this is a good topic, especially as I believe today is the International Women's
Correct. Yes.
Day. And I think it's very interesting. And I would love to read those letters. Are they they're
Yes, I
just
think that they're
normally
available.
published?
Yes.
Oh, that's fantastic. I definitely have to make a note and get those. Have a look. This is brilliant. And the more, I mean, there's so many people of this time who did write and keep diaries and all sorts of letters and everything. So we can learn so much about their daily lives and their thoughts and their motivations. And I think it's extraordinary. And to now know that there's this available, oh, brilliant. I'm quite excited about that.
She is a
it,
fascinating
yeah.
person. Even just, my dealings with her, as it were through her letters to her husband about her son, or to her son, and
Mhm.
she's not somebody who she has very strong opinions, and
Right.
very brutally practical, you might say, which she needed to be at this difficult time.
Right. Yes, it was a very tumultuous period. Um, in your book, you mentioned that as a 6-year-old child, the future Ossory had become aware of his social environment and could not have been unaffected by the drama being staged
Mm.
around him, as his mother was making arrangements for the huge influx of Protestant refugees. Could you tell us more about what was going on during this time and how that affected him, please?
Well, he's very young at this time, so we're sort of assuming and making sort of deductions based on what he's experiencing and what we know is
Mm.
going on around him. But Kilkenny, there was a siege at Kilkenny, actually by cousins, by family members who were Catholic. And so in some ways that gave them a level of protection, but not absolute. But it did allow them to be evacuated safely from the city rather than be incarcerated. He is 6 years of age. There is a dramatic escape from Kilkenny by road and then by boat, so that can't have not left an indelible impression on him. Along with the panic stricken refugees from the rural areas who flooded into Kilkenny city and are then transported to Dublin. So it's inevitable that there would be the drama would have made an impression. But
Yeah.
of course, the drama wasn't over. It was only the start of it, and that would continue right on throughout not just his childhood, but his teenage years as well. Because this is going to be a long story.
Right. Well, you mentioned his teenage years. As he grew into his teens, what sort of person was he? I mean, uh, what was going on in Britain at this time now that he's a bit older? And
Well, I
this
think this
remarkable
picture,
portrait.
yes. So this, I just want to thank Adams Auctioneers in Dublin for allowing me to access this picture from their catalogue, because the painting is now actually in private ownership. But this
Oh,
image is extracted from their sales catalogue from just before it was sold. And I think, to answer your question, the picture tells more than 1,000 words here. We have him in full battle dress, in armor,
mm.
and that is his priority. That is his primary interest. There's a lovely little anecdote from when he was much younger, of his parents are asleep in bed, and they're woken up in the middle of the night to this cacophony of sound in the room beneath them. And the Earl comes downstairs to see what it is, and it's actually Ossory stomping around in his father's boots, pretending to be a soldier. So from a very young age, we
Oh,
know that this man,
oh,
he wants the military life is something that it really appeals to him, and this is sort of a thread that permeates his entire life. I mean, he fulfills the role as a politician and diplomat, and a courtier and all of those sorts of things. But throughout all of the time, he's itching to get back on the horse into battle, and that
wow.
sort of it really punctuates his life. And here we see him in battle dress. He'd gone
Mhm.
into exile with his father as a teenager. So he's at the age of 14. We find him in Paris, and in 1649 he's entered into a military academy, where he trains basically in the arts of warfare. He's back in England in 1654, briefly, But actually, Cromwell ends up arresting him and putting him in the Tower of London in 1655 because there's a rebellion against Cromwell's rule. He hasn't actually anything to do with that rebellion, but it's just he's a royalist, leading royalist, and Cromwell isn't taking any risks. His health deteriorates quite significantly whilst he's in the Tower of London, and after, again, strong petitioning from his mother, he's given permission. Sort of Cromwell is receiving a barrage of letters and petitions from his mother. He's released in 1656 and goes into with a sort of a promise that he will not make physical connection with his father, and that he will stay in Europe and basically not cause any trouble. So he goes to Holland, where a lot of royalist exiles are based.
Loads.
And yes, and he's based in and around The Hague for most of the time thereafter until the Restoration.
Wow. Already, even just in his teens, he's experienced so many things, and witnessed so much upheaval. It's incredible. So in our next image, we see Ossory in garter robes. So by this point, it's reasonable to say he was doing all right, right?
Yes. This is another image courtesy of Kilkenny Castle and the Office of Public Works. This is much later, obviously in the middle of the Restoration period, when he has reached the pinnacle of social status and is awarded the very coveted title as Knight of the Order of the Garter, which of course is still a very important, prestigious institution in Britain today. You can actually see his stall plate. So when you're made a Knight of the Garter, you're given a stall plate in St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle, and his stall plate is still there today, along with many others. But so this really was a sort of a recognition by the king, by King Charles II, that Ossory was a favoured individual. He was a very important person. And, the general expectation is that he's following his father's footsteps. And, one day he would inherit the Dukedom of Ormond and become the second Duke of Ormond and carry on the legacy. Sadly, of course, that isn't what happens, because he predeceases his father, not to give the game away necessarily, but basically that is what happened. And this is the reason why he's been neglected, because he dies at a comparatively young age. So, by the time the Restoration comes round, he's married, which we'll talk about later, who he marries, but he's made a number of connections through his exile. He's become very good friends with a young Prince William of Orange, who becomes, significant figure in English history later on. He comes back with the king and his father in 1660 with the restoration of the monarchy. An initial period as sort of symbolic, but he serves as an MP in both the English and Irish House of Commons. And then, quite importantly, he's elevated to the position as Earl of Ossory in his own right. So this is a personal title. It's not just a symbolic title that saying that's his father's and he's using by default as an honor. This is his own personal title. So he's made an Earl of Ossory, the Earl of Ossory, in 1662 in the Irish House of Lords. So that's quite a big elevation. Again, recognizing his importance in politics at the time.
Oh, excellent. And I think you might have seen me grimacing a little bit earlier. It's because we used to live in Windsor, and St. George's Chapel was our go-to local church. It's incredible to say that. And I'm just thinking to myself, I'd never looked for his plate.
Well, it's funny because when we went to visit there, as you do, a number of years ago, and we went to Evensong in St. George's Chapel, and just randomly picked an available seat. The seats are along the side, facing in towards the aisle. And I just looked around, and I'd happened completely by uncanny coincidence to sit in his stall. It was just completely random. I hadn't even thought about looking, like you say, I hadn't even thought about looking for his brass plate. But I just, for some reason, sat in his stall. So it was slightly creepy.
But that's amazing. How fortuitous.
Yes, it was
Great.
utterly uncanny. Yes.
Wow. Yeah, and for those who haven't visited for Evensong, that is absolutely, I think, sublime. It's beautiful there.
It really was.
Um,
Yes.
yeah. um, so you mentioned he had several famous friends, including the future William III. And also John Evelyn. As it happens, today is the anniversary of William III's death, which occurred in Kensington Palace in 1702.
Yes,
Which,
correct. Yes.
yeah. Oh, it's a day of lots of stuff going on today, huh? And it's also Stuart Saturday Live, so woohoo! Would you please tell us about these friendships? And so we have, first we have William III. He's looking very serious and rather dramatic with that candle. Yeah.
So
And
classic William. Yes.
and on the right we have John Evelyn. Yep.
Yes, the great diarist. Well, I'll start sort of in chronological order. So you've got William III, as you say there. So Ossory and William became very, very good friends during Ossory's exile in the Netherlands. Some historians have speculated as to the nature of their relationship. My research indicates that it is entirely platonic and fraternal in nature. The problem with William is that he's very shy. And some would consider it aloof, but he doesn't he doesn't wear his heart on his sleeve. He's very, very private individual, but the real affection for his friends and how you can tell whether somebody really was truly a true friend, almost on the level of a brother, it comes through in the personal correspondence, and you can see that very, very clearly. And interestingly, following William obviously comes to Britain, fights James II in 1689 in Ireland. But on having sort of dealt with the threat of James and his Catholic army, he makes a specific detour back through Kilkenny City to see where Ossory was born on his way back to Dublin and then back to England. So I think that it's rather poignant. But as you say, Ossory is well connected. It was during his time in Paris, actually, that he met John Evelyn. And there's a marvelous anecdote in Evelyn's diary about an incident whereby it was a Sunday afternoon. They decided to go into the countryside, a group of them, because they had nothing better to do. And for some reason, the local villagers took this instant dislike to them and attacked them. And sort of it's this rather farcical scene where they're chased through the village with pitchforks and flames. And but it's very dramatic, and it's actually very, very funny the way it writes about it. But it just indicates, the near constant hijinks and adventures that Ossory has. So he's friends with William of Orange, and actually would be a witness at William's marriage to Princess Mary. He's also very good friends with the leading politician Henry Bennet, Earl of Arlington, and actually Henry Bennet would marry the sister of Ossory's wife. So Ossory's wife, Amelia van Beverweert, her sister Isabella, so they become familiarly connected. He's also quite close to the Duke of York, future James II, and is actually very controversially a witness to the secret marriage of James and Lady Anne Hyde, which had not received royal approval in 1660. So he was actually a witness to that. He'd met Louis XIV. He was sent to France in 1675 as an ambassador, as a temporary ambassador on the occasion of the death of the king's youngest son, to pass on Charles II's condolences. And Louis XIV had heard all about him and offers him any commission he wanted in the French army. The French army wasn't necessarily something Ossory was interested in. It wasn't really the side he wanted to play for. But this was a really impressive offer in Europe's greatest army at the time. And instead, he politely declines, and Louis gives him a very impressive jewel as a thank you for coming. So that's quite impressive. So yes, he's well connected.
Wow. Now, some of these figures that you mentioned had some connections with Barbara Villiers, who was the subject of my book,
Yes.
was published last year.
Yes.
Now, the Butler family had interactions with her as well. And Ossory is known to have been in the general social sphere as Barbara. For example, they were both in attendance at Queen Catherine's birthday celebration in 1666. And in 1673, when Barbara's eldest son with Charles II, Charles Fitzroy, was installed as a Knight of the Garter himself at Windsor Castle, the Earl of Ossory was, I believe, one of the commissioners. Yeah. Well, you probably.
I wasn't aware
so.
of that, but that, you know, it's just so nice to be able to chart other events.
It's possible, yeah. We have reason to believe he was. Now, Ossory was also in the company of another of Barbara's sons, the Duke of Grafton, when visiting his friend John Evelyn. Now, Evelyn previously said some pretty dismissive things about Grafton, but I think that the fact that he was sort of on good terms with Ossory made Grafton a little more appealing and acceptable.
Yeah, I mean,
Evelyn.
I'm surprised that they were close, because there was a sort of a legacy of antagonism between, you know, Lady Castlemaine and Barbara Villiers, and the Butlers. It goes back a long time, and there are numerous incidences that sort of erupt where you know, there is trouble, and for some reason it's connected back to her. So, you know, the most infamous of all, of course, would be in December 1670, when there was an attempt by an aptly named Colonel Blood to kidnap the Duke of Ormond on St James's Street in London. It ultimately failed, but most people at the time felt it was connected to Ormond's enemy, the Duke of Buckingham, and Barbara Villiers. So she'd been. The reasons for this, some historians say, is because it's all about factional politics. The Duke of Ormond was an ally of the King's Chief Minister, Lord Clarendon, who hated the influence of Barbara Villiers on the king, and she in turn hated him. So therefore, anyone connected to him would equally be tarnished with the same brush. But I think it goes. It's more subtle than that. So a number of years earlier, in 1660s, I think, she was thinking and hoping to marry the Earl of Chesterfield, quite a wealthy magnate, and he was looking for a very influential wife. So she sort of had aspirations in that direction, but actually he ended up marrying Ossory's sister instead. So we think the antagonism and the negativity, shall we say, it can be traced back to this point, because she misses out on that marital link.
Absolutely. Well, it's also because she and Chesterfield had everything in common, and they had a really good, about by that time, 3-year-long relationship.
Correct.
And they
if
really
rumor
ought
is
to have
believed,
married.
one of their children, you know.
Possibly, yeah. We don't know for sure.
We don't know.
That is, and possibly. But the fact was, they had been together for a long time. She was penniless, virtually, at the time. And so he wanted to have a beautiful wife with a great deal of connections and a huge dowry.
Correct, exactly.
And so
he got that by marrying.
He got that, but it wasn't a happy relationship at all. And the poor lady, I think she died when she was 25 or early 20s.
We have some letters as well where, you know, Ossory, he's the consummate gentleman. He's very chivalric. He follows the code of honor, even if it means getting in trouble, significant trouble for it. He's prepared to stand up for what's right. So he's got a great sense of honor. But you know, in a world where everything is political, it doesn't always serve him very well. So he was writing to his father, complaining about the terrible behavior towards his sister, and Ormond is like, keep your nose out of it. It's just don't interfere in someone else's marriage. Was his father's very wise response.
Oh, yeah, but you could see how Ossory was in a difficult position because he
Yes.
probably wanted to listen to his father, but also wanted to defend his sister,
Yes.
whose name was being dragged through the muck, and was very unhappy. So what a difficult situation for him. Oh, but there was another thing. There was another problem with Barbara and the situation with Phoenix Park. She was controversially gifted.
That's correct. Yes,
is this land in Dublin by Charles II.
Yes, so Phoenix Park is still there. It's the largest enclosed park in Europe. I think maybe the world. But it was essentially set up by Ormond and Ossory when they were governing Ireland at different times. It took a while to do, but Ossory oversaw a lot of it, and the stocking of deer in it, which are still there today. And then suddenly it's handed over by the king to Barbara temporarily. It doesn't last very long, but it did not go down well, and I think she found out about how unhappy Ossory and Ormond were about this, and so that was a bit close to home.
Yes, and then so I think Ormond teamed up with Arthur Capel, the Earl of Essex.
Yeah, that's correct.
And they successfully put an end to this idea that she would get this land. And then when Barbara came across Ormond in person, she let rip with angry and abusive language, and she told him she wished to see him hanged. So
yes,
she
was known for
her
temper. Yes, which she was prepared to direct at anyone, including the king. So there's no way Ormond would have escaped.
Yeah. Wow. So next up, we're going to, I think we should talk about Ossory's wife, Amelia, Countess of Ossory. And so here she is. What a lovely, stunning image. Yeah.
Yes. So, I'm very grateful for this image, actually, because it's from the Royal Collection Trust. So that's really appreciated. And it's in the Royal Collection. Beautiful portrait of the Countess of Ossory by Vissing. So she was from a Dutch noble family, very closely connected to the ruling Dutch house, the House of Oranje or Orange. Actually, an illegitimate line of the House of Orange. And her father was Prince Louis of Nassau, and he was a governor of a region of Holland at the time. And her full name was Countess Amelia van Beverweert Nassau. So they met during Ossory's exile in the Netherlands, or in Holland, sorry, specifically. And he first expresses an interest in the lady in September 1658 to his father. And this quickly escalates into a sort of a desire for marriage. Now, this was going to be very difficult to achieve for practical reasons. First of all, marriage at this time is at a noble level is a very protracted, intricate contractual negotiation with many different stages to it, including a lot of discussion of money. Number one, what dowry the wife would bring. Secondly, what sort of pension would be afforded to her in the event of the death of her by the groom's family in the death of her husband. So all of these negotiations are difficult and protracted at the best of times. But under the circumstances, the person with the purse strings on Ossory's side was his mother, who was in Ireland. His father was with Charles II, moving around various parts of Europe, usually in Brussels or in Paris or Spain at different times. And so doing all this by letter was, and trying to sort it out between their parents and their parents' agents and the family, it was an incredibly protracted process. So reading Ossory's letters, you can get the sense of desperation um, about how he was afraid he was going to lose her, and it's quite clear. What's really interesting about this is that this is not a dynastic link. This is a genuine love match. And if you can indulge me for a second, I'd love to read a little quote from one of his letters,
Yes, please.
where he outlines to his father that the nature of his feelings towards her, and basically saying how much in love he is. So he writes to his father, "I shall have never believed there was such a thing as love. Before that, I have so much jeered at others for being it. Cannot but with much shame confess that I am so much overtaken with it that I find I shall never have a concern for any other." So it's quite clear that he is sort of fallen head over heels for this lovely lady, and doesn't want to let her go, even though previously there had been talk of him making an alliance with the daughter of the Duke of Lorraine and other various sort of high level links. It ends up being a decision of his own, and ultimately, writing to his mother, who's the one who's going to have to cough up the cash for the dowry from her own estates, and she doesn't really have an awful lot of money to spare from the limited income that she's been afforded by Cromwell. She's not really happy about this, and she's also just a certain level of apprehension about what real status the lady's family has in the Netherlands or in Holland. So, anyways, so she comes across as very cold, very sort of unenthusiastic. And also he's quite put out by the fact, that his mother doesn't seem to be happy for him. So, and writing to his father to persuade his mother to allow him to marry. So it's all you can get the sense of tension, you get the sense of anxiety, but at the same time, there's the real sense of devotion he had to his wife. And even at one point, he threatens, if this doesn't happen, I'm going to run off and work in the Venetian Navy, and then everyone will be sorry for it. So he sort of makes this pretty empty threat, really. But what we get is this sort of youthful determination, and it's actually part of his nature. He's known to be a little hot-headed and impetuous. And from his mother's perspective, it's like, is this just a momentary thing from youthful enthusiasm and not real, but it'll fizzle out. But he manages to persuade his father to get his support, and then hopefully his father will persuade his mother. So, and ultimately they end up marrying in November 1659, and she returns to England with him the following year with the Restoration.
Right. And so they were able to get married. That's lovely. And how was their relationship after that? Were they contented?
They were very close. I've seen I've seen one or two references in secondary sources that indicate he had a mistress. I found absolutely no, and having done a reasonably thorough trawl through the archives, I found absolutely nothing that would indicate that. So he seemed quite devoted to her. She's
nice.
Naturalized as an English citizen with an Act of Parliament, and this is further enhanced when her sister marries the Earl of Arlington, one of the senior politicians of the era. So they have have a number of children. 5 survive, and the eldest boy being the future second Duke of Ormond. So they sort of live an extravagant life in London. Again, much complained about by his mother at the cost of it, and she doesn't understand why they want to live in London. Of course, they're a young couple who are enjoying London and the parties and the revelry at court, whereas his mother is writing letters saying, I don't know why they're living there. They could live much more cheaply in Kilkenny, back in in provincial solitude in Ireland, and Ossory and his wife have absolutely no interest in that sort of existence. So that there's a lot of cold water poured on those ideas.
Wow. Well, that seems a lovely relationship. Many people have heard of the Duke of Monmouth and his failed rebellion in 1685. Before that, however, he had some dealings with Ossory. Could you tell us what that was about, please?
I think it all comes down to the same reasons why there were clashes with Lady Castlemaine. It's all about factional politics and sort of what faction you belong in, and they did not belong in the same faction, really.
Right.
Monmouth, who was the eldest illegitimate son of Charles II. He was born in Rotterdam in 1649, son of Charles and Lucy Walters. So Charles, sort of very early indiscretion during his travels. He'd clashed with Lord Clarendon, who Ormond was allied with, so that inevitably put them in opposite camps. There was attempts at sort of preventing Ormond's appointment as Lord Lieutenant of Ireland in 1666, but that seems to be just a rumour. But there's competition as well for various lucrative court positions that brings in a lot of cash and a lot of prestige. For example, that Ossory was after, and so was Monmouth, such as the Mastership of the Horse, which is mostly a symbolic position, but it's quite prestigious in its status. So ultimately, neither end up getting it, but it again pitted them against each other. But they also had some shared experiences as well. Monmouth, a man of action, a soldier, a career soldier. That inevitably put him in a similar sort of category as Ossory, who liked to see himself as a career soldier, despite doing a lot of other things too. So they actually were, they went out into the European battlefields in the Franco-Dutch Wars in 1677 together. And interestingly, they were appointed as to undertake an investigation during the infamous Popish plot in 1678, which was a supposed plot by Catholics to murder the king and take over the Crown of England. And Ossory and Monmouth were appointed by the Privy Council to investigate this and write a report back. So they did work together too at times, but I wouldn't say they were close.
Right. Thank you. It's always interesting for me to see how these different historical figures interacted with each other. And there are all these, as you said, factions and people vying for control and power. So amazing. And so Nero, we're going further down through his life. Nearing the end of his life, Ossory was involved in the military outpost of Tangiers, which was part of the dowry of Charles II's Portuguese wife, Catherine of Braganza. But it proved to be a major liability for the English. Ossory was appointed to the governorship of Tangier by Charles II. Would you please tell us what transpired after that?
Well, I think you've summarized it very, very succinctly and accurately. It was supposed to be this, Tangiers, for those who are not aware, is a port city currently in northern Morocco. It's almost opposite Gibraltar. So it sort of forms one side of the gates into and out of the Mediterranean Sea. So it was considered to be of great strategic value. It had been a Portuguese territory and was sort of thrown in as part of Queen Catherine's dowry when she married Charles II in 1661. But as you say, it ultimately ended up having no value at all, and actually it ended up being a total drain on the English exchequer, because it was very costly to run, very costly to defend, and it was under near constant siege by the Moors, especially since 1680, which is, as you say, towards the end of Ossory's life. So reinforcements were needed. The king decided that this could not be afforded out of the English exchequer, it would have to come out of the Irish exchequer. And the then governor of Tangiers, the Earl of Ossory, was dismissed, and the post was offered in June 1680 to Ossory. Now, Ossory and the king are actually very close. Ossory had been gentleman of the king's bedchamber, which is basically the closest servants the king has, and they're usually from the most favored families or politically allied families that the king wants to show favor to. So he has a very close relationship with the king, and he's offered this position. Initially, he's honored by it. But the more he reads into it, and the more he sees the circumstances, the more he realizes that he's been given a sort of a ticking bomb wrapped in fancy paper. So he's promised 6,000 troops to go to Tangiers, but he only ends up being given 2,000. And this needs to be taken into the context that the Moors had about 17,000. So this is quite clear to Ossory, who is a military expert by this point, that there's something going on here, and he quite quickly deduces that what he's been commissioned to undertake is basically a dishonourable retreat. The English government and the King's ministers clearly are abandoning Tangiers, and Ossory feels that he's going to be blamed for it if he goes out and because there's no way he can win this with the supplies and forces that he's been allocated. So this is seen by the king as a way of getting out of his obligations in Tangiers and blaming it on Ossory. I'm not sure how the sources hold up to this. Ossory catches the king in the Palace of Whitehall a couple of days later, once he realizes the quandary he finds himself in. And he speaks to the king in quite forceful language, which he doesn't usually do. He's very respectful. I mean, it was respectful, but it was more direct than he would normally have used. And the king responded saying, like, well, it's no matter to me whether you go or not. I thought you wanted like the adventure. I thought you'd appreciate the job, but if you don't want it, never mind. And the king and Ossory then realizes that the consulted, and it all sort of goes badly from there on. So this really weighs very heavily on Ossory's mind, and it's something that it appalls his sense of honor. It appalls his military abilities, and it sort of leads to what can only be described as a nervous breakdown.
Dear.
Upon further investigation, when you sort of put all the sources together and you create a timeline, he's actually already falling ill by this stage, even though it hasn't reached its peak. He'd fallen ill at a banquet in the Fishmonger's Hall that the king attended a couple of weeks earlier. We start to see signs of his illness. But the stress of the Tangier Commission makes things worse. So he gets a fever. Lord Arlington says, you need to move out of your apartments at Whitehall, come to my house, we'll take care of you, which happens. And throughout this period, the diarist John Evelyn comes to visit him and writes the fact that he's beginning to rave, he's having fevered dreams. All he's talking about is Tangiers and how it's going to be a disaster. So it is, this is weighing very, very heavily on him, and
clearly.
Until he loses consciousness and eventually dies a few days later on the 30th of July, 1680. So that is between the illness and this sort of unwinnable task that the king has commissioned him to do, which he feels honor bound to undertake. It all just weighs so much. Yeah, so it ends up being quite dramatic.
Yes. Oh, that's absolutely dreadful. I feel so sad because he was obviously rather he was quite conscientious, and he wanted to do a good job, and it seemed like an insurmountable task for him.
Exactly.
And the stress was too much. And we know that stress can exacerbate or health problems, or even create some, I think. So
completely, yeah.
Yeah, that's very sad. Wow. Well, as we can see, he had an incredibly jam-packed life, full of adventure. I mean,
within just 40 years, yes, he managed to fit quite a bit in, yes.
Amazing. And I am currently reading your lovely book. It's beautifully done, and you can see that.
Thank you. That's very kind of you.
Yeah, I'm near the end. So near that. But I like showing it off because I really appreciate books, and I don't think enough emphasis is given on how beautiful books are. And we have some images there, the image section, and it's lovely. One image section with colored images, and In the back, we have the Butler family tree, a schedule of bills transmitted by the Lord Deputy and Council into England and not returned into Ireland. Another Parliament, attendance at the English Privy Council and the English House of Lords, and
I included all of that sort of.
yeah.
To put it very simply, in an effort to show that no matter what task he undertook, whatever job he did, he felt duty bound to try and do it to the best of his abilities. And it ties into our final story there, where we talked about the Tangiers Commission, that he wanted to do his best, but he wasn't given the proper tools.
Oh, yeah. Oh, well, it's a fascinating read, and I can already tell I recommend it. So
thank you so much.
If really beautifully done. Now, totally changing the subject. I noticed on your Instagram account that you have gone to Lock & Co, the historic Hatter, which is located just a few steps away from St. James's Palace, and also Fortnum's. Now, you're in this image here with these lovely hat boxes behind you, and the image on the right is a photo I took of the outside of Fortnum & Mason at Christmas in 2023. So can you tell us about the Stuart era connections to these two shops?
Yes, well, this is sort of, sometimes England is the only place where you find institutions like this that still exist. So Lock & Co, it's the oldest hat shop in the world. It's the hat shop that created the bowler hat in the 19th century. And they're still there today, and they're very welcoming. There's a remarkable team of assistants in there who really, really know not just their stock, but know their history too. And there's a wonderful little museum at the back. You've got everything from Nelson's hat to Churchill to Roosevelt. So it really is, and a lot of modern stars as well. So it really, it's an institution, and it was founded in 1676. So it is there, and ironically, it's on the same street where Colonel Blood tried to abduct the Duke of Ormond in 1670. So, but it's a lot safer, and so it's a lovely place to visit, which I thoroughly recommend. And Fortnum & Mason, of course, as well, another Stuart era store. 1707 was when it was founded. It was actually founded by a footman of Queen Anne. And Queen Anne, the last Stuart monarch, of course, she was obsessed with having brand new candles in every room every evening. So that meant a lot of half-burnt candles were just removed and thrown out. And this footman resold those used candles and made enough money to set up a grocer's shop, which is the origin of Fortnum & Mason's. But you have so many shops like this in England. You also have, of course, Eden Ravenscroft, which I'm not sure anyone knows about, but it's one of the oldest tailors. It's a Savile Row tailor, and they've been around since 1689. So just within our Stuart period. And they've the royal warrant holder for making royal robes, so they were very busy for the coronation in 2023. They also make legal wigs and academic robes, but they're tailors as well. A number of suits made from them as well.
Oh, I love that. I love how there are some shops that have their origins in the Stuart period. I don't know. I find that rather romantic in some ways.
Yes, absolutely.
I like it. Yeah. Oh, right. Wow. So I have one final question for you. I love asking this for everyone, so I'm sure you've heard of it. Stuart Fantasy Dinner Party. Who would you invite? What would you serve? And who would you have sitting beside you?
Well, the Stuart era really is the era of the great feast, isn't it? I mean, of course, you have great feasts in the medieval period, but they reached their sort of their peak in the Stuart era, with in the 17th century, with Louis XIV having his great public feasts at Versailles. This being copied, we have that famous picture, that Van Dyck picture of Charles I dining at Whitehall, and with Henrietta Maria and the court looking on. So the 17th century really is an era of great feasting. I think when you ask this question, I'm immediately struck, for our Stuart period, I'm immediately struck by the diarist Samuel Pepys, whose diaries are just so wonderful to dip in and out of. But he used to hold and I always thought this actually, even when I first read about it back as an undergraduate, he used to hold an annual feast to celebrate the successful cutting of his gallbladder stone and removal of his gallbladder stone, which many men, due to the diet at the time, had to undergo this operation, and not all survived. But he did survive, even though the stone that was removed was about the size of a billiard ball, and he managed to survive. And in order to celebrate, he held what he called his annual stone feast, which was this huge meal, and he'd ask his best friends and his closest acquaintances to this annual feast, and he would serve dishes after dishes after dishes, and we can see in his diaries what he served each year and compare it. So you had, so I would love to have attended one of these, because Samuel Pepys I find a fascinating character. He brutally honest about his own failings and his own inadequacies. And there are some moments in his diaries that are literally just laugh out loud, because his writing is so evocative. I remember one situation where he was in church and sitting beside a pretty young girl, and he decided to touch her inappropriately, and she rammed her hat pin into his leg. But he was so brutally honest about this, how he squealed at high pitch in the middle of church service. So it was very entertaining. So I think he would be somewhat lecherous, but I think he's definitely a character that I would love to have spent an evening with. And I think if I were to spend an evening with him, I think it would be best spent at one of his annual stone feasts.
That's really cool. Very nice. Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Daniel. It was a pleasure to have you on the show today.
Very enjoyable. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Take care.
Take care. Well, that concludes another episode of Stuart Saturday Live. Thank you for spending time with me today. And us, exactly. You can buy your own copy of Daniel's book, Thomas Butler, Earl of Ossory, from the publisher itself, Four Courts Press, the link to which will be found under the YouTube video. Well, Stuart history lovers, I would like you to check your social media in the next few weeks, because I'm going to have a rather big announcement, and I'm really looking forward to it. And I can't say any more yet, but it's pretty big. So I can't wait. Anyway, I hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your weekend. And I do hope you'll join me next month when I'll be doing a solo Shakespeare special. All right? And there's much to prepare for that. And so that's all for me for now. And so I hope you all have a wonderful day. Don't forget to keep it Stuart. Goodbye.